good job and such good words to those songs. Amazing Grace of God. You know, that pastor talked about praising the King and praising the Lamb. Folks, the amazing thing, one of the amazing things about the Christian faith is how those things could possibly be. How can the Lamb, the meek, mild Lamb, be the King? But he actually is. And you get to the book of Revelation, and it speaks of the Lamb who is on the throne. That's very good theology and presented well in our singing. Thank you. We're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 8. I was talking to some kids and asking about going back to school, and did they enjoy it? And some said, well, I'm looking forward to it a little bit, not other ways. And I said, why don't you call mixed emotions? One of them said, I don't have mixed emotions. I don't want to go back. I was honest. Okay? And that's the way it is. I have mixed emotions with. But my problem was, I was telling some of the other folks coming in, my first day back and having to go back to class was the first cool day that we had. It was too hot to get out and do anything. I had all kinds of things we wanted to do. Couldn't do it. First day back, I told my wife, I said, this is the perfect day to do something outside, and this is the first day that I can't do it. But I'm not complaining. I am thankful to be alive and thankful for every day that the Lord gives to me. And I know you are. I am glad to be here, and I hope you are glad to be here, and that we want to continue our worship of the Lord as we have through prayers so far, and through singing, and now through the hearing and responding to the Word of God. You know, in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, Paul says to that church that's in the city of Philippi, he says, your citizenship is in heaven. Now it's interesting, why would he have said that to them? He didn't say that to the other people, churches that he wrote letters. He said, your citizenship is in heaven. Why was that particularly relevant to that church at Philippi? And the reason is, the city of Philippi, the members of that city actually had Roman citizenship. Most people aren't aware. The vast majority of people in the Roman Empire did not have Roman citizenship. They lived there, but they did not have the rights of citizens. Only a relatively few number did. And if you remember, for other reasons, the Apostle Paul himself was a Roman citizen. That's why, if you'll remember, it's reported in Acts 16, where they had beat Paul, and then Paul, I don't know why he didn't tell them before, but he said, you know, you just beat a Roman citizen. And they said, uh-oh, we didn't know you were a Roman citizen. They could have gotten in serious trouble because they violated his rights. You remember there was another occasion, Paul knew he was getting ready to go on trial, and he was not going to get a fair trial locally. So you know what he did? He appealed to Caesar to hear his case. Folks, just anybody couldn't do that. You had to be a Roman citizen. Well, the city of Philippi, everybody that was citizens of it, did have Roman citizenship. And so Paul was reminding them, hey, yes, it's okay to be proud of your Roman citizenship, but your real citizenship that you need to be the most proud of and the most thankful for is your heavenly citizenship. Now, when Paul said to them, your citizenship is in heaven, he wasn't denying that they had Roman citizenship, and he wasn't denying that was a good thing. It's just like today, as believers, we have dual citizenship. You know, we're citizens of the nation that we live in, but we are also citizens of that heavenly kingdom. And in most cases, or in many cases, you know, there's not a conflict there. We're citizens of this country, of this community, and so we sort of all, in some ways, dress alike, you know. We speak the same language. We, for the most part, eat, even though it's a great variety, you know, our types of foods. We have our types of recreation, and just because I'm a citizen of the earthly kingdom doesn't mean I don't dress like my citizenry here, that's certainly understandable. Now, there are times, as you're aware, that our heavenly citizenship and the values of our heavenly citizenship come into conflict with what are many of the values of our society. For instance, and we could go in many directions, a person whose citizenship is in heaven, they do not feel the freedom to abort an inconvenient birth, okay? They do not practice cohabitation before marriage, okay? That may be done in the society, but our citizenship is in heaven, okay? That takes priority. Now, there's one place that I can think of, and that doesn't mean this is the only one, but there's one place in which it is very appropriate for us as Christians, even because of our dual citizenship, that we have one set of values and value something one way from our heavenly citizenship, but exactly the opposite from our earthly citizenship. You say, what would that be? It's very subtle. Folks, it's our understanding of success. Our understanding of success. It is very proper for us as believers who are citizens of this world and of this society to have a certain standard of what it is to be successful. So I'm going to come back and talk about that. But we are also citizens of the heavenly kingdom, and we're also supposed to have in other areas, we're supposed to have a view of success that is very different than what's in the world. Okay? Everybody with me? And that's what I want us to look at. And actually, we see it in this passage in 1 Kings chapter 8. Now, we're going to begin with verse 12 here. This is at the time of the dedication of the temple. Okay? Solomon was the third king, and he's the one who's leading this worship service, so to speak, to give official opening of the temple. Okay? And this is actually sort of, we pick it up in the middle of their service here. Now, look at verse 12. It says, Then Solomon said, The Lord has said that he would dwell in a thick darkness. I have indeed, though Solomon says, built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell forever. So what's he saying now? He says, back in Exodus 19, the Lord dwelt with them, you remember, in that thick, dark cloud. He sort of followed them, and that cloud sort of served two purposes. Yeah, and they almost look like they're contradictory purposes. It was a dark cloud. Do you like to have a dark cloud hanging over you? No, and so there was something about that dark cloud that was supposed to instill dread and fear and awe into them. And folks, that's the presence of God. And it ought to do the same thing for us today. Instill. What it is saying is God is saying, I am unknowable unless I tell you who I am. You will never figure out who God is. He is unapproachable. He is holy. He is other than we are. We're to stand in awe of him. There's this dark cloud. But folks, why was the cloud there at all? Because he wanted to be near his people. He wanted to be other than his people, but he wanted to be near them. And so that seems to me the best explanation of why he is saying here, the Lord was going to dwell in darkness, the darkness of that cloud. But he said, I have built a glorious temple for you. And that temple is actually going to allow God to do those same two things. To be transcendent, holy. It was a majestic temple. The literal translation here was a princely temple. A place for him to dwell, where looking at it very itself, it reminded us that God is righteous and holy. He is unapproachable. He is different than we are. But yet, in that temple, God dwelt. He was near his people, but he was yet transcendent, above, and awe-inspiring and holy. And so Solomon says, hey, if you look on down to verses 27 and 28, Solomon makes it very clear. You didn't need this temple, okay? Everything belongs to you. You can make your own temple. So don't think for a moment we did you a favor that you couldn't do. Okay? So that's how it looks like verses 12 and 13 fit in here. But now look at verse 14, because he addresses God and then he turns to the congregation. And look what he says, beginning in verse 14. The king turned and blessed the assembly of Israel while the assembly of Israel stood. And here's what he said. Blessed be the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth. He promised a long time back there was going to be a temple and he was going to dwell with them. And now he has fulfilled that. So, okay, with his hand, he has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth. Because let me tell you something, God's still doing that. God is still in the business of fulfilling with his hand what he said with his mouth. There's another way of saying that. Every promise that God has ever made, he has fulfilled it or he is in the process of fulfilling it. Okay? So this is a general statement about God as well. Friends, what God has promised, he is going to do. Now, he doesn't always do it immediately, because you've been saying there was going to be a temple for a long time. But he just got around to doing it. Remember this about God. He's slow. God is slow. He is never late. We got it? God is oftentimes slow. He doesn't do something when we think he ought to do it. But if he promised it with his mouth, he fulfills it with his hand. And that's what he has done here. Now, let's look at the application of it here. What did he do? Since the day, he says, that God says, since the day I brought my people out of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I did choose David to be over my people Israel. And he says, now it was in the heart of my father, Solomon says, my father David, to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. It was in his heart to do it. Okay? But the Lord said to David, my father, whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. You wanted to do it. Now, folks, David was a man who accomplished a lot. Okay? If you look up, as some people also, if you look up the word failure in the dictionary, David's name or picture will not be beside it. Okay? Obviously, he was not perfect, but he was a man after God's own heart. And it would take quite a while for me to delimit for you, set forth, delineate everything that he had ever done. David was a successful man, but there's one place he had considered himself a failure. What David wanted to do above everything else that he accomplished was build a temple for God in Jerusalem. If he looked back over his life, if you could read David's life story, he would have a chapter called The Place Where I Failed. Okay? I did not build this temple that I wanted to do. I set my heart on that, and David would have considered himself a failure. But folks, I want you to notice this. Look at that verse 18. The Lord said to my father David, listen, he didn't say, yeah, you're right, David, you're a failure. Look what he says. Whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well. David is saying, I didn't do well. God is saying, you did well. David said, I'm not doing well. I didn't get the temple built. God is saying, you did well because you wanted to. And friends, God doesn't look at what's in our hands. He looks at what's in our heart. And that's precisely the way it was with David. And folks, I imagine David is not alone here, even when we consider just the folks of us here. I would imagine that there are more than a few people here that have areas of their life that they look at that way. And they say, this is something I really wanted to do, and I wasn't able to do it. I feel like a failure, and that is not God's evaluation. And friends, let me remind you, ultimately his evaluation is the only one that matters. My opinion doesn't matter. Your opinion doesn't matter. God said basically to David, no, you succeeded. You did a great job building that temple. And they said, well, I didn't build the temple. He says, I know. But it was in your heart to do it. You wanted to do it. And yet again, God doesn't look at what is in our hands. He looks at what is in our heart. So, what do we see here? Folks, what we see is two different standards of success, or you could even say definitions, two definitions of success. Folks, the world in which we have our earthly citizenship has a standard of success, and it ought to have that standard. We're going to look at it. It's not wrong. It's not bad. Okay? In fact, it has to be, or just about we couldn't exist. But in our heavenly kingdom, and in our heavenly realm, and in our heavenly citizenship, it's completely different. And this is what I want you to see. I want you to look, first of all, and see that the standard of success for earthly citizenship, the standard is basically, I guess there's many ways I could say it, get the job done. Get it done, okay? If you don't get it done, you're a failure. I remember reading some years ago, I think it said 40 keys to success. Number 1, get it done. The other 39 don't matter. Get it done. Accomplish it. Meet the goal. Reach the standard. Folks, and again, that's really the way it ought to be. That's the way it should be. I mean, you can think of many examples. Think of a salesperson. You know, a company needs people to sell things for them, and so they hire a salesman or a salesman. And the person tries, and they read up on sales techniques, and they study their product, and they just can't make a sale. You know what's going to happen? Y'all with me? You know what's going to happen? They're going to be looking for another job that's not in sales, okay? You say, but wait a minute, they tried. They gave it, well, that's great, but that's not good enough. If we're going to have you on the payroll, you're going to have to meet the standard. And folks, that's the way it ought to be. You can see that, how many of you know that most of your car dealers, when you take them to your car to get it fixed, when you say, when they say, okay, this is what's wrong with it, this is what it's going to cost, what they do is they already have it timed out how much they're going to do. They'll say, okay, we look at the book, that's 2 hours of labor. We charge this much by the hour, and that's what it is. Now, folks, then they hire people that can do the job quicker than that. Okay? They're not clicking on the clock and telling you, they're saying by this job, it's a 2-hour labor job. But they hire people that can do it quicker than that, and they make more money that way. Okay? Now, what happens if they have somebody that constantly is taking longer than that? They're not going to have a job very long. You know why? Because they're not getting the job done. They're not being successful. You know, you say, well, they tried. They were working fast as they could. And they're going to say, I know, and we appreciate your effort, but you need to be finding another job. And folks, that's the way. I looked at athletics is this one. I think it was last year in the NFL, 25%, 1 out of 4 head coaches lost their job at the end of the year. 25%. You know why? Folks, it wasn't because they didn't try. It wasn't because they were not trying to put you know why it was? They didn't get enough wins. They said, well, do you know how much time I spent looking at film? Yeah, we do, and we appreciate it. But you just didn't get enough wins. And folks, if you don't get enough wins, you're not going to have a job. I like what old Bum Phillips said about coaches. He was one himself. He said there's 2 kinds of coaches. There's those who got fired, and there are those who are going to get fired. Okay? And that's about right. As soon as you start losing, and usually most coaches can't continue to win and win and win all the time, and it finally gets to where that's not good enough. It's not that they didn't try. They gave it their best effort. The fact is, there's a bottom line, and that is get the job done. And folks, athletics, it's a business, you know. That's just the way it is. The best players have jobs, the others don't. The coaches that are winning at the time have, and I'm just saying, that's the way it is, and that's the way it ought to be. Okay? So that's the standard of success, and I as a Christian have no problem with that in relating to our earthly citizenship. That's the way it is, and that's the way it ought to be. Those people can find a job in which they do something better, but that's the way society is. Now, what we see, though, is that when things relate to our heavenly kingdom and our heavenly citizenship, the situation is different. Again, look at verse 18. The Lord said to David, my father. Now, here's David. I'm a failure. I didn't get it done. I didn't accomplish it. And he says, where it was in your heart to build my house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Folks, that's a reverse of how things are in the earthly kingdom. Okay? And it ought to be. That's not God's standard of success. In other words, if you look at, verse 18 very well spells it out. Jesus touches on this in his own teaching. Remember, he said, in that day and in that kingdom, the first will be last, and the last will be first. Folks, that's a complete switching of the order of the way we experience things in our earthly citizenship. Okay? I mean, it is true. There's a first. There are people that are first in this world, and you know the kind of people I'm talking about. I mean, they will have an article about themselves on Wikipedia. Okay? You know why? It wasn't because they were failures in their field. They got the job done. They did it. They accomplished it. They're the people who people are always seeking their autographs. Maybe their pictures are hanging up in their office or in their living room or in their bedroom. Why? Because they were successful. They got it done. You know, they didn't just try to invent things that would help society. They actually did. And they're well known, and they ought to be. They were successful. They were first. And so there is a first. But just because they were first in an earthly existence does not mean they're going to be considered first in the heavenly kingdom. In fact, usually it is reversed. The last are going to be first. Folks, the kind of people, in fact, I want to read to you from Isaiah chapter 66, verses 1 and 2. Because, well, it just addresses specifically what I'm talking about. Who is it that gets God's attention? Folks, it's not a great inventor. It's not a great race car driver. Okay? It's not a good politician necessarily. That's not the ones that gets God's attention. First of all, he begins by reminding us of how exalted God is. The Lord said, heaven's my throne. You know, he could have said that to Solomon. Solomon said, I built you a temple here and got you a throne here. But heaven's is my throne. You know, I don't need that. But that's how great God is. The earth's my footstool. Okay. Where there's a house that you can build for me, where's the one? Where's the place that I can rest? And then he says this. Now, that's how majestic God is. So, worldly thinking would probably say, well, there's probably these real important people that get his attention. You know, if he's that great, he gives his attention to great people. He says, my hand made all of these things. Thus, all these things came into being, declares the Lord, by me, but the one on whom I will look, to him who is humble and of a contrite spirit and who trembles at my word. Because you know who gets God's attention? The humble. The ones who tremble at his word. The people who are contrite in spirit. Okay? That's who gets God's attention. Okay? That's because things are flip-flopped. They're reversed when it comes to the issues of the heavenly kingdom. In fact, we can see this in many, many places. I think of there was a great revival in China in the 1930s. Okay? We read a lot about it. There was one of the leaders of that, a man that was actually converted in that, and then became one of the great leaders of that revival, preaching the word of God. His name was Watchman Nee. Watchman Nee was a brilliant guy. He had gone to college and he was in law school. And when this revival broke out and he was converted, he poured his life into the preaching of the gospel. And to the point that it cost him his health, you know. It cost him what his future was going to be. And one day, he said, I was walking down the street, and one of my former law professors was about to pass me, and he saw me. And he said, are you Watchman Nee? And he said, yes, I am. He said, look at you. You know, physically you're broken. You know, he said, you know, you're one of the people that we had our highest hopes for. And look at you now. Well, Watchman Nee thought for a minute, that's terrible. Look at him. He's right. Had a great future. You know, but you see, here's what was going on. This man was judging Watchman Nee by that worldly standard of success. Okay? You didn't get it done. You didn't graduate. You didn't become a great lawyer. You didn't make a lot of money. You could have been a great person of political influence, and you didn't do it. And friends, God is saying to Watchman Nee, great job, buddy. What a great job. You are successful. I see what is in your heart and what you actually did. I think of Dorothy Carey. Most people have never heard of Dorothy Carey. She was the wife of William Carey, who is the father of modern missions, who got the modern missions started in England and got mission organizations started. And then he himself went to India with his family, his wife Dorothy, where he translated the Bible, or at least some facsimile of it, into 18 different languages. Okay? Because everybody that knows anything about missions knows about him. His name's up there, okay? But what most people don't know is that while they were there, they had very serious problems. A couple of their children were diseased and died in their youth. And Dorothy, considering the loss of their children and the hardships, the last days of hers on earth had to be spent in a padded cell where she would not harm herself until she died. She basically went insane. Don't you know what it looks like? There's a loser. You know? Well, there's a loser. And I'll tell you something. Folks, when God writes the history of missions, there's going to be a chapter on Dorothy about the contribution that she made and how successful she was as a missionary. You know why? Because God doesn't judge success the way the world does. He wasn't judging her success by what was in her hand, but what was in her heart. I could even draw this closer to home. I have to be very careful because this young man is still with us. I grew up in a church with a young man right about my age. He had some mental deficiencies, brain deficiencies. I think it was some problems from birth that he had, maybe in the process of birth. His brain was damaged to some degree. He didn't have a sense of smell. It affected him. He couldn't smell anything. But this guy loved and loves the Lord. And he would share with me the great things that he wanted to do for the Lord. He never was able to do any of those things. He tried his hand at college. He made it a couple of years, but the grade point average was so bad, he had to quit, had to drop out. Okay? He just couldn't go any further academically. But everywhere he went, he was telling people about Jesus. And believe it or not, he was a fairly good speaker and very funny. You know, you said, but there were things he planned to do and he could not do, and he never pastored a church. He never held an outdoor crusade, whatever, where by under a tent. All these things he wanted to do, he never got to do them. And now, he had heart trouble all of his life, and now he is confined to a senior living home. Okay? He has a room. And you know what he does in that room? He gets on the computer and he set himself up to preach online. And he has people listening to him all over the country. Now, not a lot, and he has them in different countries in the world. And he has found out how to go online, and you can turn into him the name of your church, as long as it's an evangelical Bible-believing church, And he'll put that on his website. So if you are not able to go to church, you can go click one of these. He put on his Facebook page yesterday, my goal is still every day to share Christ with at least one person. Now, folks, listen. In the eyes of the world, this guy's a failure. Okay? He never got educated. Okay? He never did his religious life. He never passed the church. He never accomplished any of the goals that he wanted. And if he was not careful, he could think, what a failure I am. Folks, he is not a failure. In fact, he's one of them that Jesus is talking about. In my kingdom, the last are going to be first. Now, I never did find out and document that Billy Graham said this. If he didn't say it, he should have. Okay, I think he did. But somebody asked him on one, said, you know, the first will be last. When we talk about sitting in heaven nearest the throne of Jesus, who has the most prominent place? Who is that going to be, do you think? And Billy Graham said it's going to be somebody none of us has ever heard of. It's going to be people like Warren. It's going to be people like Dorothy. It's going to be people like Watchman Nee. Folks, when you really actually use that worldly standard to other people, maybe even biblical characters, you're going to find out they were failures. I mean, read the first chapter of Jeremiah. God told him, you're going to preach and preach, and the people are actually going to get worse. You know, look, I'd hate to have to preach if God told me, hey, you know, I would say, is my preaching that bad? You know? Well, it wasn't that his preaching was that bad, it's that the people were that bad. And he basically told them, you're going to preach, and you're going to preach. And you're just supposed to keep on preaching. And told Isaiah the same thing in Isaiah 6. You know, you're going to preach and preach. And he said, how long you want me to do it? That's all he said, there's nobody hardly going to listen to you. The nation's going to be destroyed. You just be faithful. And folks, in the eyes of the world, Isaiah and Jeremiah were absolute failures. Failures. Okay? Not only that, think about Jesus. Lives to be 33. You know how long his enemies lived? You know, most of them a long life. And here's a guy that never did go to school. You know, never did have a bunch of a following. 12 people, and they weren't worth a flip. You know, you read the passages. You know, they got better after the resurrection. You know, had nothing to show for it. He gets crucified when he's 33 because he can't keep his mouth shut. You know, if he keep his mouth shut and keep his thoughts to himself, he could have lived a long, full life, but the guy's a loser. And folks, he is a loser, according to the standards of the world. Okay? Because God is not judging things, and us either, by the standards of the world. He is judging not by whether or not we got the job done, but what was in our hearts. What did we desire to do? Danny Akin, Dr. Akin is the president of the Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. And I heard him preach one day, and what he was talking about here, because I want to make this point. My children, when they were growing up, never heard me pray a prayer such as this, because I never prayed one anyway, such as that. They never heard it because they didn't do it. Lord, help them be successful in whatever they do. Whatever they do, just help them be successful. I never prayed that. They never heard that. But I'll tell you what they heard regularly. Lord, help them to be faithful. Lord, whatever they do, help them to be faithful to you and remain committed to your will and your word. You know what? Because if they do that, they're successful. They could be successful in the world's view of things and failures in God's sight. And so I remember in that regard, Dr. Akin telling of how he was preaching a sermon one day, and he said, let me ask you what you would want for your children. Let's take some of you who have boys. You know, would you want your son to grow up to be a great athlete, win the Heisman Trophy, get a lucrative contract in in the pros, okay, and have a great career, and at the end be elected to the Hall of Fame? Or would you rather your son go to a mission field, to places where people have never heard the gospel, and have God glorified through the message of the gospel, and souls brought to him, and even be persecuted and die from that on the mission field? So that tells you something, he says, about what you see about success. He said, I had a man come up after me. He said, I'll tell you one thing. I want my son to be the football player. That's what I do. And so I asked Dr. Aiken after he was over. I said, man, I said, what did you say to him? And he said, I just said, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry you feel that. Because, folks, that is a very unbiblical view of success. Okay? Well, God's standard is in verse 18, as we can see. Now, folks, here's the danger. We won't have to confront it. Because when we say God's standard here is not what you accomplish, per se, there are some people who would be very not genuine, disingenuous here and say, okay, it really doesn't matter what I do then. You know, I can just not try very hard, and God's looking at. Now that reminds me of a certain. That's disingenuous. That's not focusing on what you do. You didn't do what you could. That's the thing. Of these two farmers, and one of them said, you've been my best friend my whole life. He said, if I had 2 cows, I'd give you one of them. He said, would you? He said, yeah. He said, if I had 2 tractors, I'd give you one of them. He said, would you? Yeah, I would. He said, if you had 2 pigs, would you give me one of those? He said, you know good and well I've got 2 pigs. Well, folks, that's it. What he was saying is, let me tell you what I could do if I had this that I don't have. The question is, what are you doing with what you do have? And that's the question we have to be confronted with even here. This would wrongly make some people comfortable here and say, well, I don't really have to accomplish. But let me show you, that's not true of David. The reason God said this of David is David didn't go around saying, Lord, let me tell you what I would have done if I could have. He said, let me show you what I tried my best to do. And that's why when David was, as the scripture uses, when he was laid to rest with his forefathers, folks, there was not a temple there. There was not even a foundation of that temple built. But you know what was there? There was an accumulation to some degree of materials to build the temple with. And you know who got it? David didn't take the attitude, well, if it's going to be known as Solomon's temple and not David's temple, by golly, he can just do all the work. If he's going to get the credit for it, let him do it. You see, the reason God gave David essentially the credit for building the temple is he not only wanted to, he tried to. He actually did the best that he could. He didn't say, let me tell you how much I would have done if I could have. He was truly able to say, no, I didn't get to do it, but let me show you what I did do. And folks, that's completely different. I mean, that's why we think of the widow in the New Testament, the widow's mite. Remember, Jesus was standing there by and watching people put money in the plate. By the way, Jesus is still doing that. Jesus is still doing that. That's vital in the life of a Christian and of stewardship. Okay, but that wasn't the point here. Jesus was standing there, and here comes a widow and drops in a smallest little, what we would call today, less than a penny. And you know what Jesus said? He called attention to her. She probably thought she was a failure. It's not even worth me bringing this up here. This is going to be embarrassing. And Jesus said she gave more than everybody else did. Because it's not based on how much she gave, but what she wanted to give. She didn't say, well, let me tell you what I'd give if I was rich. She didn't do that. She said, I'm going to give what I can, even though I'm not rich. And that's why I keep saying, God was not looking at what was in her hand. He was looking at what was in her heart. She had a desire to do and a desire to give, and she did what she could. Now you look at Mark chapter, I think it's 14, where Jesus is getting close to his time for his crucifixion, and a woman comes in and breaks open a box of very expensive perfume, basically, and just anoints Jesus with it. Now, some people say that's a waste of money. Folks, anything you give Jesus is never a waste of money. Okay? He didn't evaluate it that way. But you know what he said? He used this very phrase. He said, she did what she could. You see, she couldn't save him from going to the cross. She couldn't do that. She couldn't make his life better in a lot of ways. She couldn't take the pain from him. But she did anoint him. She did what she could. So see, it'd be easy for her to say, well, I'd do something for Jesus if I had an army and I could go out there. She didn't have an army. So what did she do? She did what she could. And Jesus said, that's all I demand. That's all I ask. Do what you can. It was in your heart to do this. Folks, I can think of the Good Samaritan. You know, why do we call this guy a Good Samaritan? The first thing, well, he saved this guy's life. No, that's not it. No, that's not why. You see, he would have still been the Good Samaritan if this man would have died. You understand? He's not a Good Samaritan because he saved this guy's life. He's a Good Samaritan because he tried to. That's what the other two people didn't do. Now, they probably went home. The two probably went home and told their kids and their parents, let me tell you this terrible event. This guy was dying. If I would have been a doctor, if I would have known first aid, if, the fact is, they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything. This man tried. He did something. And whether the man lived or died, that was not in this man's hand. I can't control that, okay? But what he could control is, was he going to do what he could? So you know why he's the Good Samaritan? Because he did what he could. It was in his heart to save the man's life. And even if he would have died, he would have gotten credit in God's eyes for saving the man's life, even though he didn't. Because God doesn't look at what's in the hand. He looks at what's in the heart. Now, folks, what's great about all this is it really enables every one of us to start out on equal ground. Okay? But because we can't look at somebody and say, well, this guy it can do a lot more. This lady, she's just so much more gifted than I am. Well, you're not going to be judged by how gifted she was and what she did. We're going to be gifted by what we have and what we did with what we have, regardless of how much it is. That is, nobody else, because of how gifted they are or whatever else, has a better chance at success than you do. You have the exact same, you know why? Because the ground of the basis of success is where you faithful. Not what, that's why, folks, Jesus didn't say to these folks when they pass away and enter the kingdom of heaven completely in glory, he doesn't say, well done, thou good and successful servant. He didn't say that. Because you know what? That'd leave most of us out. Most of us weren't very successful in a lot of things we attempted to do for the Lord. And he's not going to evaluate them. So the fact is, nobody, no other Christian, regardless of how more gifted they are, how much more finances they have than you, none of that is going to matter. Every one of us has the possibility of having an equal level of success. And another way of saying that is, folks, that ultimate victory, success, is actually within the reach of every one of us. Success is within your reach. Folks, every person can't be successful in everything they try according to the standards of the world. But every one of us can be faithful. Every one of us can do the best that we can. Every one of us can have in our hearts to do certain things that we're not able to do. But can I just make a couple of applications to this? Folks, there may be people sitting here who you poured your life into your children, and you had them raised in a church. Okay? You prayed for them and with them. And you did everything that you could to see that they turned out right. And they may have abandoned the faith. They may not be at all living. And you know what God's saying? What a successful parent you are. And you're saying, God, I have a wayward son or daughter. And God says, I know that. That was their choice. Okay? That wasn't your choice. You did a great job as a parent. You were successful because God is not looking at the outcome in their life. He's looking at your life, and He's looking at your heart. Through the years, I've talked to people, and it's usually women in this case because they're the ones that usually this kind of thing happens to. I've had more than a few say, in my youth, I wanted to be a missionary. And I just think God was calling me to be a missionary. And they would describe some of the things that happened in their life. Folks, in one case, it was a woman's husband left her. They were planning to go to the mission field, and all kinds of things. And they said, the thing that I wanted to do the most, I wasn't able to do it. And you know what? God is saying to them, boy, you did such a great job as a missionary. They said, no, I never did get to go. He said, I know you didn't get to go, but it was in your heart to go. You wanted to go. And God is looking at what's in our heart. Folks, the same thing can be true of evangelism. People that we have prayed for and sought to evangelize. And you're going to get to heaven. And God's going to say, man, what a success you were in leading that person to Christ. He said, really? I didn't know they ever came to Christ. He said, they didn't. I'm not judging what's in your hand. I'm judging what's in your heart. You wanted to, and you tried. And you did well that it was in your heart to do it, and you tried. So folks, what questions do we ask ourselves? Here's what we need to ask ourselves in life. What are your desires? What is it you really want to do? What is that really one thing, the big thing maybe? Or the two or three things? And I would ask you this. Is it the kind of thing that if you succeeded with it, God would say, what glory that brings to me? Is it that kind of thing? Friends, if it's not, ditch it right now. Ditch it. Because even if you accomplish it, it's not worth having in God's sight. Make sure the goal, the desires that you do have, are the desires that He actually would want you to have. And then I would say this. Don't let Satan rob you of your joy. Where you have tried to do something and you failed. And the devil tells you you're a failure, you're a failure, you're a failure. Because if you wanted to do it and you gave it your best, you are not a failure. God is the one who determines success or failure. And He doesn't. Do not let Satan rob you of that joy. And I would also say this. When we have that understanding of success, and it just means to be thankful, you don't have to worry about failing in the worldly sense of it. I have read more than one survey in which senior citizens were asked several questions about life. And one of them, in at least two of these cases that I read, the question was this. If you had life to live over again, what would you do? And a large number of them said, you have to understand what I meant. They said, I would take more risks. I didn't mean by that, I'd drive the car faster and see if I know what they meant. They meant, I look back at my life and there were things that I didn't attempt to do because I was afraid I would fail. Folks, here's the wonderful thing about the kingdom of God. You never have to feel that way. You never have to say, that's just beyond me. I'm saying if God lays it on your heart, go for it. Work toward it. Do the very best that you can with it. And the results are in God's hands, and God looks at it and says, you did well. You did well. Because it was in your heart to do it. Now, let me just say in conclusion, folks, there's one place this does not apply. Okay? Nobody is ever going to. There's a lot of things I can say, Lord, I tried to get educated and I couldn't. I tried to get a job doing this and I couldn't. I tried to invent stuff and I couldn't. All that might be true. It's never true that a person could say, I tried to be saved and I couldn't. And the reason is you don't get saved by trying. You get saved by quit trying and asking God to do what only He can do. When it comes to salvation, we will be successful if we are faithful. Because our faith and confidence is not in ourselves. It is in who Jesus is and what He did for us. And our ultimate confidence must always